The phone call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, cutting through Detective Sarah Chen's dreamless sleep like a blade through fabric. Her hand found the receiver before her mind fully surfaced from the depths of exhaustion that had become her constant companion over the past 15 years on the Duluth police force. "Chen," she answered, her voice hoarse with sleep and the residue of too many cigarettes she'd promised her daughter she'd quit smoking. "Sarah, it's Lieutenant Morrison. We got her. We finally got her." The words hung in the cold air of her small apartment, heavy with implications that made Sarah's chest tighten. She knew immediately what "her" meant, though it had been 8 months since anyone had spoken seriously about the Amelia Taylor case. 8 months since the department had quietly moved the file from active to cold, despite Sarah's protests. 8 months since the last witness interview had yielded nothing but the same circular maze of half-memories and contradictions that had plagued the investigation from day one. Amelia Taylor? Sarah's feet hit the cold hardwood floor, her body already moving toward the closet where her service weapon waited in its holster. The familiar weight of 20 years in law enforcement pressed against her shoulders as she cradled the phone between her ear and shoulder, reaching for clothes that would shield her from the November wind that howled across Lake Superior like a living thing. DNA match came back an hour ago, ironclad. The blood on that sweater fragment we found near the old grain elevator, it's hers, Sarah. But here's the thing that's going to turn this whole damn town upside down. The person who had Amelia's sweater all these years, the person who's been living free while that family suffered, Morrison's voice cracked slightly, a sound Sarah had never heard from the 25-year veteran. It's Rebecca Martinez. Sarah's hand froze on the doorknob of her closet. Rebecca Martinez. The name echoed in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of disbelief through everything she thought she knew about the case. Rebecca Martinez, who had organized the search parties in those first desperate weeks after Amelia vanished, Rebecca Martinez, who had held Amelia's mother, Catherine, while she sobbed at every press conference. Rebecca Martinez, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for missing children in northern Minnesota, whose face had appeared on local news dozens of times over the years, advocating for victims' families with a passion that seemed to burn from some deep personal well of understanding. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, but even as the words left her lips, fragments of memory began shifting like puzzle pieces, finding their proper places. Rebecca's insistence on being involved in every aspect of the investigation, her uncanny knowledge of details that hadn't been released to the public, the way she'd sometimes corrected witnesses' statements with information that only someone intimately familiar with Amelia's final hours could have known. 20 years she's been playing us," Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength as the initial shock transformed into the focused anger of a cop who'd been made a fool. 20 years she's been hugging that woman at memorial services, helping organize fundraisers, sitting on the goddamn victim's advocacy board while Amelia's body was rotting in some grave we still haven't found. Sarah pulled on her jeans with hands that trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the magnitude of what Morrison was telling her. 20 years. Amelia would have been 38 now if she'd lived. Instead, she remained frozen in time as an 18-year-old girl with bright green eyes and dreams of becoming a veterinarian, whose smile from her high school graduation photo had stared back at Sarah from the case file countless times over the years. The drive to the station took 12 minutes through empty streets that glistened with the first frost of the season. Sarah's breath fogged the windshield as her car heater struggled against the November chill that seemed to seep into everything in Duluth by this time of year. It looked different somehow, as if the revelation about Rebecca Martinez had shifted the very foundation upon which the community had built its understanding of one of its most notorious unsolved cases. As she turned onto Superior Street, Sarah caught sight of the billboard that had stood at the corner of Fifth Avenue for nearly 2 decades. Amelia's face, eternally young and hopeful, gazed down at the city with the words "still missing" beneath her photograph. Below that, a phone number that had generated thousands of tips over the years. Most useless, some promising, none leading to the truth that had apparently been hiding in plain sight. The station buzzed with unusual activity for 4:30 in the morning. Officers Sarah recognized from the day shift stood around the coffee machine, their faces bearing the peculiar mix of excitement and solemnity that accompanied major breaks in cold cases. She spotted Detective Mike Kowalski, her partner for the past 3 years, hunched over his desk with what appeared to be the entire Amelia Taylor file spread before him. Mike's usually immaculate appearance showed signs of having been hastily assembled. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie crooked, and his salt and pepper hair stuck up at odd angles. "Christ, Sarah!" Mike called out as she approached. "You seen this? Look at this." He held up a photograph from 2005, taken at a candlelight vigil for Amelia on the 2nd anniversary of her disappearance. In the foreground, Catherine Taylor clutched a white candle, her face etched with the particular kind of grief that comes from hope deferred too long. Behind her, barely visible in the soft glow of dozens of candles, stood Rebecca Martinez. But it wasn't Rebecca's presence in the photo that made Sarah's breath catch. It was the expression on her face. While every other person in the photograph bore the somber countenance appropriate to the occasion, Rebecca's face showed something else entirely. Her eyes weren't focused on the memorial or on Catherine's suffering. Instead, they were fixed on something beyond the camera's frame with what could only be described as satisfaction. It was subtle, easily missed by anyone not looking for it, but unmistakable once seen. "How in the hell did we miss this?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. They'd missed it because Rebecca Martinez had been hiding in plain sight, cloaked in the protective armor of apparent grief and righteous advocacy. She'd positioned herself so perfectly within the community of those seeking justice for Amelia that suspecting her would have seemed not just unlikely, but almost blasphemous. Lieutenant Morrison emerged from his office carrying a thick manila folder that Sarah recognized as the Rebecca Martinez background file they'd obviously been hastily compiling. His face showed the strain of a man who'd just realized that one of his department's most trusted civilian contacts might be responsible for one of their most heinous unsolved crimes. Warrants being processed as we speak. Judge Hendrickson was not happy about being woken up at 4 in the morning, but when I explained the circumstances, he expedited everything. We move on her house at 6 sharp. "Sarah, Mike, you're with me on the arrest. I want this done quietly, no media circus until we have her in custody and can figure out exactly what the hell we're dealing with." Sarah nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead to the moment when they would knock on Rebecca Martinez's door. Rebecca lived alone in a small ranch house on the outskirts of town, a modest dwelling that she'd shared with her late mother until the older woman's death from cancer 3 years ago. She had been to the house twice over the years, once for a Christmas party Rebecca had hosted for the families of missing persons, and once to interview her about a potential sighting of Amelia that had turned out to be another dead end. She remembered the house as neat but cluttered, filled with the accumulated memories of 2 women who'd lived quiet lives. The walls had been covered with photographs, family gatherings, Rebecca's work with various charitable organizations, candid shots of the search volunteers who'd spent countless hours looking for Amelia in the forests and along the shoreline of Lake Superior. It had felt like the home of someone dedicated to preserving memories, to honoring the connections between people that made communities strong. Now the memory of those photographs took on a sinister quality. Had Rebecca been collecting trophies of her deception? Had she taken some perverse pleasure in surrounding herself with images of the very people she'd been manipulating for 2 decades? The clock on the station wall ticked toward 5:30 a.m. as the arrest team made final preparations. Sarah checked her weapon, reviewed the warrant one more time, and tried to push down the mixture of excitement and dread that always preceded major arrests. This wasn't just any collar. This was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of investigation, the answer to questions that had haunted not just the police department, but an entire community. As they prepared to leave the station, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the window that looked out onto the parking lot. At 47, she looked older than her years, worn down by too many late nights and too many cases that had ended in disappointment rather than justice. The Amelia Taylor case had been her white whale, the one that had driven her to work weekends and holidays, to follow up on the most improbable leads, to keep pushing when everyone else was ready to let the case fade into the cold file archives. But now, as dawn approached on what might finally be the day they brought Amelia's killer to justice, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years: genuine hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had sustained her through countless false starts and dead ends, but the solid, grounded hope that came from evidence and facts and DNA matches that couldn't be argued with. The drive to Rebecca Martinez's house took place in relative silence, 3 squad cars moving through the early morning darkness like sharks cutting through deep water. Sarah rode in the lead car with Morrison and Mike, watching familiar streets pass by while her mind churned through everything they knew and everything they still needed to learn. Rebecca's neighborhood was one of those quiet residential areas that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of well-maintained suburban peace. The houses were modest but well-kept, with small yards and driveways occupied by sensible cars that spoke of middle-class stability rather than wealth. It was exactly the kind of place where a killer could hide for 20 years, protected by the assumption that monsters lived elsewhere, in other neighborhoods, among other kinds of people. As they pulled to a stop 2 houses down from Rebecca's address, Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Through the pre-dawn gloom, she could see that lights were on in Rebecca's kitchen window. Either she was an early riser, or she knew they were coming. The woman who answered the door at 6:02 a.m. looked nothing like a killer, which Sarah supposed was exactly how she'd managed to evade suspicion for 2 decades. Rebecca Martinez stood in her doorway wearing a faded blue bathrobe over flannel pajamas, her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bearing the confusion and concern of someone awakened by unexpected visitors. She was 53 years old, though she looked younger, with the kind of unremarkable features that made her blend into any crowd. Average height, average build, the sort of person who could disappear into the background of any gathering, a quality that probably served her well over the years. Officers? Rebecca's voice carried the right note of puzzlement, tinged with the kind of worry that any law-abiding citizen might feel when confronted by police at their door before sunrise. Her eyes moved from Morrison to Sarah to Mike, taking in their serious expressions with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Is everything all right? Has something happened?" Sarah watched Rebecca's face carefully, looking for any crack in the facade, any sign that the woman knew why they were there, but Rebecca's performance was flawless, her body language consistent with someone who had no idea that her carefully constructed life was about to crumble around her. "Rebecca Martinez, you're under arrest for the murder of Amelia Taylor." Morrison's words cut through the morning air like a physical blow. Sarah saw Rebecca's face change, watched the color drain from her cheeks as her mouth fell open in what looked like genuine shock. "What? That's impossible. There must be some mistake." Her hands went to her throat, a gesture that seemed instinctive, defensive. "Amelia Taylor? But I helped look for her. I've spent years trying to find out what happened to her." "Yes, you have," Sarah said, stepping forward as Morrison read Rebecca her rights. 20 years of helping us look in all the wrong places." As the handcuffs clicked into place around Rebecca's wrists, Sarah found herself studying the woman's face with new eyes. The features that had seemed unremarkable now carried hints of calculation, as if Rebecca was already working through her options, considering her next moves. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like relief. The search of Rebecca's house began immediately after her arrest. Sarah had obtained a warrant that covered the entire property, and as she stood in Rebecca's living room, she felt the weight of 2 decades pressing down on her. Somewhere in this ordinary house were the answers they'd been seeking for so long. The living room looked exactly as Sarah remembered it from her previous visits. Comfortable furniture arranged around a small television, bookshelves lined with romance novels and true crime paperbacks, family photographs covering every available surface. But now, with the knowledge of Rebecca's guilt, everything took on a different meaning. The true crime books weren't just casual reading, they were research. The family photographs weren't just memories, they were props in an elaborate deception. Detective Mike Kowalski emerged from the back bedroom, carrying a small wooden box. "Sarah, you need to see this," he called, his voice tight with controlled excitement. The box was old, made of cedar, with brass hinges that had begun to tarnish with age. It looked like the kind of keepsake box that might hold jewelry or important documents, the sort of thing passed down from mother to daughter. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with time, were the remnants of Amelia Taylor's final day. A silver bracelet that Catherine Taylor had described in countless interviews, the one Amelia had been wearing when she disappeared. A small notebook with Amelia's handwriting, filled with what appeared to be veterinary school application notes and sketches of animals. A photograph of Amelia with a young man Sarah didn't recognize, both of them smiling at the camera with the unconscious joy of people who believed they had unlimited time ahead of them. But it was the item at the bottom of the box that made Sarah's hands tremble as she lifted it out. A driver's license issued to Amelia Michelle Taylor with an address that Sarah had memorized years ago. The photograph showed Amelia at 18, her green eyes bright with anticipation for a future that had been stolen from her just weeks after this picture was taken. "She kept trophies," Mike said quietly, voicing what they were all thinking. "Jesus Christ, Sarah, she kept pieces of that girl like souvenirs." The basement yielded even more disturbing evidence. Behind a false wall that had been expertly constructed to look like part of the foundation, investigators found what could only be described as a shrine to Amelia Taylor. Newspaper clippings about her disappearance covered one wall, arranged chronologically from the initial missing person reports through the most recent anniversary stories. Photographs of the search efforts were pinned to a corkboard, including several that hadn't been released to the media. Photos that could only have been taken by someone involved in the searches themselves. But the most chilling discovery was a journal, its pages filled with Rebecca's neat handwriting, documenting her thoughts and feelings about Amelia's case over the past 20 years. As Sarah read through the entries, she began to understand the psychological landscape that had motivated Rebecca Martinez for 2 decades. This wasn't just a case of murder followed by cover-up. Rebecca had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which she was simultaneously Amelia's killer and her most dedicated advocate. She'd inserted herself into the investigation, not just to avoid detection, but to maintain some twisted form of connection to her victim. The forensics team working in Rebecca's backyard made another significant discovery around noon. Ground-penetrating radar had detected an anomaly beneath what appeared to be a well-established flower garden in the back corner of the property. As investigators carefully excavated the area, they uncovered a metal box buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. Inside the box were more of Amelia's personal effects, her cell phone, wallet, and car keys. But more importantly, there were items of clothing that had clearly been cut away from her body, some still bearing dark stains that would undoubtedly test positive for Amelia's blood. The careful preservation of these items spoke to a level of premeditation and psychological disturbance that made Sarah's skin crawl. By late afternoon, the picture of Rebecca Martinez that emerged from the evidence was of a woman who had been living a carefully constructed double life for 20 years. To her neighbors, co-workers, and the community at large, she was a dedicated advocate for missing persons, someone who channeled her apparent compassion for victims' families into meaningful volunteer work. But in the privacy of her own home, she'd been nurturing an obsessive relationship with her crime, replaying it, analyzing it, and inserting herself into its ongoing investigation in ways that fed some deep psychological need. The interview room at the Duluth police station had hosted thousands of conversations over the years, but Sarah couldn't remember ever sitting across from someone's calm demeanor felt quite so unsettling. Rebecca Martinez had waived her right to an attorney, a decision that surprised everyone involved, and had spent the better part of 3 hours answering questions with a composure that bordered on eerie. "Tell me about the night Amelia disappeared," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that had been coursing through her system all day. The table between them held a thick file folder containing 20 years' worth of investigation materials, but Sarah kept her attention focused on Rebecca's face, watching for any tell that might reveal more than her words. "I've told you everything I know," Rebecca replied, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I helped search for her. I organized volunteers. I comforted her family. I did everything I could to help find out what happened to her. Except tell us the truth about what you did to her." For the first time since her arrest, something shifted in Rebecca's expression. The mask of confused innocence slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "You don't understand. None of you ever understood what Amelia was really like." Sarah leaned forward, sensing that they were finally approaching something real. "Tell me what she was really like, Rebecca." She paused, seeming to search for words. "She was beautiful, yes. Everyone always talked about how beautiful she was. But she was cruel too, selfish. She used people, manipulated them, took advantage of their feelings for her own benefit." "Is that why you killed her? Because you thought she was cruel?" Rebecca's laugh was soft, almost wistful. "I didn't kill her because I thought she was cruel, Detective Chen. I killed her because I loved her, and she was going to leave." The confession hung in the air between them, 20 years in the making. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized they were finally going to learn what had happened on that October night in 2003. "Tell me about that night, Rebecca. Tell me what really happened." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on something Sarah couldn't see. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting years for someone to ask her this question. "She came to my house. It was late, after midnight. She was upset about something, some fight with her boyfriend, I think. She often came to me when she was troubled. I was like a mentor to her. Someone she could talk to about things she couldn't discuss with her parents or her friends her own age." Sarah made notes as Rebecca talked, but she was also recording every word. After 20 years, they were finally going to know the truth. "We sat in my kitchen, drinking tea. She was crying, talking about how no one understood her, how everyone expected her to be perfect all the time. I held her, tried to comfort her. And then she said," Rebecca's voice caught slightly, "she said she was thinking about leaving Duluth, just disappearing for a while, starting over somewhere new where no one knew her. And that upset you." "It terrified me," Rebecca admitted. She was the most important thing in my life. The thought of her leaving, of never seeing her again." Rebecca shook her head. "I couldn't let that happen." The details that followed painted a picture of a confrontation that had escalated far beyond what Rebecca had intended. According to her account, she'd tried to convince Amelia to stay, had become increasingly desperate as Amelia insisted on her plans to leave town. The conversation had grown heated, then physical, and in a moment of rage and desperation, Rebecca had struck Amelia with a kitchen knife. "I didn't mean for her to die," Rebecca insisted, though her eyes told a different story. "I just wanted her to understand how much she meant to me, how much I needed her to stay. But she kept talking about leaving, kept saying I was being dramatic, that I was acting like some kind of crazy stalker." Sarah listened to the confession with a mixture of satisfaction and revulsion. After 2 decades of investigation, they finally had their answers. But the truth was somehow more disturbing than any of the theories they'd developed over the years. Rebecca Martinez hadn't killed Amelia Taylor in a moment of random violence or for financial gain. She'd killed her out of a possessive love that had twisted into something monstrous. "What did you do with her body?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I buried her," Rebecca said simply, "in the woods north of town, near the old logging road. I knew those woods well from all the search parties we organized over the years. I made sure to put her somewhere we'd already looked, somewhere no one would think to search again." As the interview concluded, Sarah found herself thinking about Catherine Taylor, Amelia's mother, who had spent 20 years wondering what had happened to her daughter. In a few hours, Catherine would finally have answers to the questions that had haunted her for 2 decades. But Sarah wondered if the truth would bring peace or just a different kind of pain. The news broke at 6 p.m. on Channel 8, just as families across Duluth were sitting down for dinner. Sarah watched the broadcast from her desk at the station, observing as the anchor's carefully modulated voice delivered information that would fundamentally alter how an entire community understood one of its most enduring mysteries. In a stunning development, Duluth police have arrested Rebecca Martinez, a longtime victim's advocate, in connection with the 2003 disappearance of 18-year-old Amelia Taylor. Martinez, who has spent nearly 2 decades organizing search efforts and supporting the Taylor family, allegedly confessed to killing the young woman during a late-night confrontation at Martinez's home. Sarah's phone began ringing immediately. The first call came from Captain Rodriguez, demanding a briefing on the media strategy. The second was from the district attorney's office, requesting copies of all evidence collected during the day's searches. The third call, the one that made Sarah's stomach clench with dread, was from Catherine Taylor. "Detective Chen, I saw the news. Is it true? Did Rebecca really—" Catherine Taylor's voice carried the weight of 20 years' worth of accumulated grief, hope, and exhaustion. Sarah had delivered bad news to countless family members over her career, but this conversation felt different. Catherine wasn't just learning that her daughter's killer had been caught. She was learning that the woman who had held her hand at memorial services, who had organized fundraisers in Amelia's memory, who had become almost like family over the past 2 decades, was the person responsible for destroying her life. "Mrs. Taylor, I think it would be better if we talked in person. Are you at home? I can be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Catherine Taylor's house took Sarah through the heart of Duluth's residential neighborhoods, past houses where families were probably gathered around television sets discussing the day's shocking revelations. The Taylor house sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees, their bare branches creating intricate patterns against the darkening November sky. Sarah had been to this house dozens of times over the years, usually to deliver updates on the investigation or to re-interview Catherine about some detail that might have been overlooked. Catherine answered the door before Sarah could knock. At 58, Catherine looked older than her years, worn down by 2 decades of unanswered questions and the peculiar strain that comes from living in a state of perpetual uncertainty. Her brown hair, now heavily streaked with gray, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her eyes, the same green as her daughter's, showed a mixture of exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "Come in, Detective, please." Catherine's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the effort it took to maintain that composure. The living room hadn't changed much over the years. Photographs of Amelia covered the mantelpiece and side tables. School pictures, family gatherings, candid shots that captured the young woman's infectious smile. But now, knowing what they knew about Rebecca Martinez, Sarah found herself wondering how many times Rebecca had sat in this very room, surrounded by images of the girl she'd killed. "Tell me everything," Catherine said, settling into the same chair she'd occupied during countless previous interviews. I need to know what happened to my daughter." Sarah had prepared for this conversation during the drive over, but she still struggled to find the right words. How do you explain to a mother that the woman she had trusted with her deepest grief, the person who had seemed to understand her pain better than anyone else, was actually her daughter's killer? "Mrs. Taylor, based on Rebecca's confession and the physical evidence we've collected, it appears that Amelia went to Rebecca's house on the night she disappeared. According to Rebecca, Amelia was upset about something and came seeking comfort or advice." Catherine nodded slowly. "Amelia did that sometimes. She was so good with young people. She seemed to understand them in a way that adults don't always do. I was grateful that Amelia had someone like that to talk to." The irony in Catherine's words was almost unbearable. Rebecca had indeed understood young people, had indeed understood Amelia in particular, but her understanding had been possessive and ultimately deadly. According to Rebecca's statement, Amelia mentioned that she was considering leaving Duluth, starting over somewhere new. This upset Rebecca considerably, and an argument ensued that became physical. Sarah watched Catherine's face as the implications of these words sank in. For 20 years, Catherine had constructed elaborate theories about what might have happened to her daughter. Random abduction, a stranger encounter gone wrong, some terrible accident that had taken Amelia away from everyone who loved her. The reality that Amelia had been killed by someone who claimed to love her, someone Catherine herself had loved and trusted, was perhaps more devastating than any scenario she had imagined. "She killed my baby because Amelia wanted to leave town. That's why Rebecca took her away from me." Sarah reached across the space between them and took Catherine's hands in her own. They were cold, trembling slightly, and Sarah could feel the weight of 2 decades worth of grief in that simple contact. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Taylor. I know this isn't the closure you were hoping for." Catherine was quiet for a long time, staring at a photograph of Amelia that sat on the coffee table between them. In the picture, Amelia was maybe 16, wearing her high school softball uniform, her face flushed with exertion and joy after what was obviously a victory. It was the kind of photograph that captured not just a moment in time, but the essential spirit of the person being photographed.
"All these years," Catherine said finally, "Rebecca was at every memorial service, every anniversary, every candlelight vigil. She helped me organize the scholarship fund in Amelia's name. She sat with me in this very room when I couldn't stop crying, when I felt like I was going crazy from not knowing what happened." Sarah nodded, understanding the depth of betrayal that Catherine was processing. Rebecca Martinez hadn't just killed Amelia Taylor. She'd spent 20 years manipulating and exploiting the grief of everyone who had loved her. "There's something else you need to know, Mrs. Taylor. We believe Rebecca has been monitoring the investigation all along. She positioned herself as a helpful civilian, someone with insights into missing persons cases, and we trusted her input. She may have influenced the direction of our searches, steered us away from areas where evidence might have been found." The full scope of Rebecca's deception was still being uncovered, but it was already clear that her involvement in the investigation had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. She'd attended strategy meetings, offered suggestions about search areas, and even provided psychological insights into what might have motivated Amelia's disappearance. All the while, she'd been protecting herself and feeding off the very grief she'd caused. Catherine stood abruptly and walked to the window that looked out onto her backyard. The space was small, but meticulously maintained, with flower beds that showed the care of someone who found solace in nurturing growing things. Sarah had always imagined that Catherine's dedication to her garden was connected to her need to create life and beauty in a world that had seemed determined to take both away from her. "Detective Chen," Catherine said without turning around, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course." "Do you think Amelia suffered? When she killed her, do you think my daughter was in pain?" It was the question Sarah had been dreading, the one that pierced straight to the heart of every parent's worst nightmare. Based on Rebecca's confession and the physical evidence they'd collected, Sarah had formed her own opinions about Amelia's final moments. But sharing those opinions with Catherine would serve no purpose except to add more pain to an already unbearable situation. "Mrs. Taylor, I think Rebecca acted in a moment of rage and desperation. Based on what she's told us, I don't believe Amelia suffered for long." It wasn't entirely truthful. The forensic evidence suggested a struggle that had lasted several minutes, but it was as close to kindness as Sarah could manage under the circumstances. Catherine turned back toward the room, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. 20 years, Detective. 20 years I've been wondering if she was cold, if she was frightened, if she called out for me and I wasn't there to help her. And all that time, the person who knew exactly what happened was sitting right here in this room, pretending to care about finding answers. The media attention intensified over the following days as details about Rebecca Martinez's double life began to emerge. Local television stations ran extensive coverage, interviewing neighbors who expressed shock at the revelation, colleagues from Rebecca's volunteer work who struggled to reconcile the woman they'd known with the killer she had apparently always been. The story attracted attention from national news outlets as well, drawn by the unusual circumstances of a victim's advocate who had actually been the perpetrator of the crime she'd spent decades pretending to help solve. Sarah found herself fielding calls from reporters across the country, all seeking details about what was already being called one of the most bizarre criminal cases in Minnesota history. The questions were always the same. How had Rebecca Martinez managed to maintain her deception for so long? What signs had investigators missed? How many other cases might have been compromised by her involvement?
That last question was particularly troubling. Over the years, Rebecca Martinez had inserted herself into dozens of missing persons cases across northern Minnesota. She'd organized search parties, counseled families, and provided input to law enforcement agencies who had valued her apparent expertise. Now, every one of those cases would need to be re-examined to determine whether Rebecca's involvement had compromised the investigations or whether she might have been connected to other disappearances. Detective Mike Kowalski was leading that effort, working with agencies across the region to identify cases where Rebecca Martinez might have played a role. The preliminary results were disturbing. In at least 6 other missing persons cases over the past 20 years, Rebecca had been among the first civilians to volunteer for search efforts. In 3 of those cases, she'd been the person to discover key pieces of evidence that had ultimately led investigations away from the areas where the missing persons were later found. "It's like she was addicted to it," Mike told Sarah as they reviewed the case files in the station's conference room. The attention, the drama, the power that came from being the person everyone turned to when someone disappeared. She wasn't just covering up Amelia's murder, she was feeding off the whole experience of being involved in these investigations. The psychological evaluation of Rebecca Martinez, ordered by the court as part of the pre-trial proceedings, painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose motivations were complex and troubling. Dr. Patricia Winters, a forensic psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, spent 12 hours interviewing Rebecca over the course of several days. Her report provided insights into the psychological landscape that had produced one of Minnesota's most unusual serial manipulators. Ms. Martinez presents with a complex personality disorder characterized by narcissistic traits, an inability to form healthy attachments, and a profound need for control and attention, Dr. Winters wrote in her evaluation. Her involvement in victim advocacy work appears to have served multiple psychological needs simultaneously. She was able to position herself as a helper and comforter while actually maintaining control over the narrative of her own crime. The attention and respect she received from law enforcement and victims' families fed her narcissistic needs, while her intimate knowledge of investigative procedures allowed her to stay one step ahead of detection. The community's reaction to Rebecca's arrest and confession was complex and multifaceted. At the Duluth Community Center, where Rebecca had organized countless fundraising events for missing persons causes, Director Janet Murphy struggled to process the revelation that their most dedicated volunteer had been living a lie for 20 years. "Rebecca was like family to us," Janet told Sarah during an interview about Rebecca's volunteer work. "She showed up for every event, donated money when she didn't have much to spare, worked with grieving families with a compassion that seemed to come from some deep personal understanding of loss. To learn that that she was the cause of the very pain she was pretending to heal, I don't know how we process something like that." The Northwoods Missing Persons Support Group, which Rebecca had helped establish in 2007, faced an existential crisis. The organization had provided comfort and practical assistance to dozens of families over the years, but its foundation had been built on the credibility and expertise of a woman who was now revealed to be a killer. Members of the group gathered at the community center on the Thursday following Rebecca's arrest, trying to decide whether the organization could continue to exist. "Everything we built together feels tainted now," said Margaret Hendricks, whose son had disappeared during a camping trip in 2009. "Rebecca helped me through the darkest period of my life. She held me when I cried, helped me organize search parties, gave me hope when I felt like giving up. How do I reconcile that with what she did to Amelia Taylor? How do I trust my own judgment about anything ever again?" The meeting, which Sarah observed from the back of the room, revealed the deep psychological trauma that Rebecca's deception had inflicted on an entire community. These weren't just strangers who had been fooled by a skillful manipulator. These were people who had opened their hearts to Rebecca during their most vulnerable moments, who had trusted her with their deepest fears and most desperate hopes. Father Michael O'Brien, the priest at St. Michael's Catholic Church, where Rebecca had been a regular parishioner for 15 years, struggled with his own sense of betrayal and responsibility. During their weekly counseling sessions, dozens of parishioners had confessed their doubts about God's plan, their anger at a world that could allow innocent people to simply vanish without explanation. Father O'Brien had often referred these troubled souls to Rebecca Martinez, praising her dedication to helping families find peace in the face of unimaginable loss. "I recommended her to people who were suffering," Father O'Brien told Sarah during a conversation in his office, surrounded by religious texts and photographs of church activities that featured Rebecca prominently. "I told grieving parents that Rebecca understood their pain, that she could help them find meaning in their suffering. I feel complicit in her deception, even though I had no way of knowing the truth." The ripple effects of Rebecca's arrest extended far beyond Duluth city limits. Police departments across Minnesota began reviewing their cold cases, looking for connections to Rebecca Martinez that might have been overlooked. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension established a task force specifically dedicated to examining her potential involvement in other crimes. Detective Lisa Chen from the Hibbing Police Department contacted Sarah about a case that had always troubled her: the 2008 disappearance of Marcus Johnson, a 22-year-old college student who had vanished after leaving a party near the Iron Range. Rebecca Martinez had been among the civilian volunteers who had searched the area where Marcus was eventually found 3 months later, and she had been the one to suggest expanding the search to include the remote cabin where his body was discovered. "At the time, we thought she was just more thorough than the other volunteers," Detective Chen explained during a phone conversation with Sarah. "She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of where a frightened person might try to hide. But now, knowing what we know about her involvement in the Taylor case, I'm wondering if her intuition was actually based on direct knowledge." The investigation into Marcus Johnson's death was officially reopened, as were 4 other cases where Rebecca Martinez had played significant roles in the search efforts. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing.
Rebecca appeared to insert herself into investigations involving young people who fit a specific profile. Attractive, intelligent individuals in their late teens or early 20s who had expressed some form of dissatisfaction with their current circumstances. Dr. Winter's psychological evaluation suggested that Rebecca had been drawn to people she perceived as ungrateful for the advantages they possessed. Ms. Martinez appears to have harbored deep resentment toward young people who, in her view, failed to appreciate the opportunities available to them. Her journal entries reveal a pattern of obsessive thinking about individuals she believed were wasting their potential or taking their circumstances for granted. The media attention surrounding the case attracted the interest of criminal profilers from across the country, many of whom saw Rebecca Martinez as a unique example of what they termed a helper killer, someone who commits murder and then inserts themselves in the subsequent investigation or support network, feeding off the very grief and desperation they had caused. FBI profiler Dr. James Patterson, who had studied similar cases for over 20 years, offered his analysis of Rebecca's motivations during a conference call with the Duluth Police Department. What makes Miss Martinez particularly dangerous is the length of time she was able to maintain her deception, Dr. Patterson explained. Most helper killers are caught within a few years because they can't resist the urge to reveal their knowledge, or because they make mistakes that expose their involvement. Miss Martinez managed to sustain her role for 20 years, which suggests an unusual level of self-control and psychological sophistication. The question of whether Rebecca had killed other people became increasingly pressing as more details about her behavior patterns emerged. The careful way she had preserved Amelia Taylor's personal effects, the meticulous documentation of the investigation's progress in her journal, and her systematic involvement in other missing persons cases all pointed to someone whose criminal behavior might have extended far beyond a single act of violence. Detective Sarah Chen found herself working longer hours than ever, coordinating with law enforcement agencies across 3 states to identify potential connections between Rebecca Martinez and unsolved disappearances.
Over the past 25 years, always finding work in social services or volunteer organizations that put her in contact with vulnerable populations. The town of Grand Rapids, Minnesota, where Rebecca had lived from 1998 to 2001, proved particularly interesting to investigators. During her 3-year residence there, 2 young women had disappeared under circumstances that bore striking similarities to Amelia Taylor's case. Both victims had been involved in mentor relationships with older women in the community. Both had expressed desires to leave their small-town environments, and both had vanished after late-night encounters that their families had never been able to fully explain. Sarah made the drive to Grand Rapids on a gray November morning, the kind of day when the sky seemed to press down on northern Minnesota like a heavy blanket. The town was smaller than Duluth, with a main street lined by businesses that looked like they'd been struggling to survive for decades. The local police chief, Robert Anderson, met her at the station with files that hadn't been opened in years. "I remember Rebecca Martinez," Chief Anderson said as he spread the case files across his desk. "She was involved with the Family Crisis Center here, did a lot of work with domestic violence victims. Seemed like a genuinely caring person, though there was something about her that always made me a little uncomfortable." The files contained information about Jennifer Walsh and Susan Morrison, both 20-year-olds who had disappeared within 6 months of each other in 1999. Jennifer had been working as a waitress at a local diner while saving money for college, expressing frustration to friends and family about feeling trapped in Grand Rapids. Susan had been involved in an on-and-off relationship with a boyfriend her parents disapproved of, and had talked about running away to Minneapolis to start fresh. Both young women had been found dead in remote locations months after their disappearances. The causes of death had been difficult to determine due to the condition of the bodies, but both cases had been classified as homicides, based on the circumstances of their discoveries. No suspects had ever been identified, and the cases had eventually gone cold. Rebecca Martinez was involved in the search efforts for both girls, Chief Anderson explained, pointing to volunteer rosters that showed Rebecca's name among the civilian searchers. She was also the one who suggested we expand the search area to include the locations where they were eventually found. At the time, we thought she was just more dedicated than most volunteers, willing to explore areas that others considered too remote or unlikely. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. Rebecca Martinez hadn't just killed Amelia Taylor. She had likely been responsible for multiple murders over a period of several years, using her position as a community volunteer and victim advocate to identify potential victims and then to control the investigations that followed their disappearances. As Sarah drove back to Duluth that evening, she found herself thinking about the families of Jennifer Walsh and Susan Morrison. Like Catherine Taylor, these families had spent years wondering what had happened to their daughters, had probably been grateful for the support and dedication shown by volunteers like Rebecca Martinez. The revelation that their daughter's killer had been hiding among their supporters would reopen old wounds and raise new questions about how well anyone could truly know the people around them. The preliminary hearing for Rebecca Martinez was scheduled for December 15th, just over a month after her arrest. As that date approached, the pressure on the Duluth Police Department intensified. Media representatives from across the country had descended on the city, drawn by the unusual aspects of the case and the potential connections to other unsolved murders. The court had already received requests from several documentary filmmakers and true crime authors seeking access to case materials and interview opportunities. District Attorney Margaret Foster, a veteran prosecutor with 23 years of experience, faced the challenge of presenting a case that was both straightforward and incredibly complex. The physical evidence connecting Rebecca Martinez to Amelia Taylor's murder was overwhelming. DNA, fingerprints, and Rebecca's own confession provided a clear foundation for prosecution. But the broader implications of Rebecca's 20-year deception and the potential connections to other crimes created complications that would require careful management. This isn't just about getting a conviction for Amelia Taylor's murder. We're dealing with someone who may have been operating as a serial killer for decades, using her position in the community to identify potential victims and cover her tracks. The evidence we present in this case will set the foundation for potential prosecutions in other jurisdictions. The families affected by Rebecca's crimes struggled to process the magnitude of her deception. Catherine Taylor found herself questioning every interaction she'd had with Rebecca over the past 20 years, wondering how many times the woman who had killed her daughter had sat in her living room, offering comfort while secretly reliving the crime that had destroyed Catherine's life. Support groups formed spontaneously among the people who had been manipulated by Rebecca Martinez. The Duluth Community Center offered free counseling services for anyone who felt they had been deceived or exploited by Rebecca's involvement in their personal tragedies. The turnout for these sessions was overwhelming, revealing just how extensively Rebecca had inserted herself into the community's network of support for people dealing with loss and trauma. The preliminary hearing took place in Duluth's historic courthouse, a building that had witnessed nearly a century of legal proceedings, but had never hosted a case quite like this one. Judge Patricia Hendrickson, who had presided over countless criminal cases during her 15 years on the bench, looked unusually grave as she reviewed the mountain of evidence that prosecutors had assembled against Rebecca Martinez. Sarah sat in the gallery, watching as Rebecca was led into the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to drain all color from her face. The woman who had spent 20 years presenting herself as a pillar of the community now looked small and diminished, her carefully maintained facade finally stripped away to reveal something much more ordinary and far more dangerous. DA Margaret Foster rose to present the prosecution's case, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years' worth of accumulated evidence and community betrayal. Your Honor,
The defendant, Rebecca Martinez, stands accused not just of murder, but of orchestrating one of the most elaborate and cruel deceptions in this state's legal history. For 2 decades, she has manipulated grieving families, compromised police investigations, and fed off the very suffering she caused. The evidence presented during the hearing painted a comprehensive picture of Rebecca's crimes and deceptions. Forensic testimony confirmed that DNA evidence found in Rebecca's home matched Amelia Taylor's blood, that fibers from Amelia's clothing had been discovered in Rebecca's basement, and that soil samples from Rebecca's backyard contained traces consistent with human decomposition. But it was the psychological evidence that proved most disturbing to everyone present. Dr. Patricia Winters took the stand to explain her evaluation of Rebecca Martinez, describing a personality so twisted by narcissism and need for control that she had turned the community's grief into a source of personal gratification. Ms. Martinez exhibits what we call a savior complex, Dr. Winters testified. She needed to be seen as the person who could solve problems, who could provide comfort in times of crisis. But because she had created the very crisis she was pretending to address, she was able to control every aspect of the narrative. She knew exactly what the families needed to hear, exactly how the investigation should proceed, because she had all the information that everyone else was desperately seeking. Rebecca's defense attorney, Martin Webb, faced an almost impossible task. His client had confessed to the murder, physical evidence linked her definitively to the crime, and her 20-year pattern of deception had alienated any potential sympathy from the community. Webb's only viable strategy was to argue for diminished mental capacity, suggesting that Rebecca's psychological disorders had impaired her ability to understand the nature of her actions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with a profoundly damaged individual, Webb argued during his opening statement. Ms. Martinez's actions, while inexcusable, were the product of severe mental illness that warped her perception of reality and her relationships with other people. She genuinely believed that she was helping the people she was actually harming. The argument fell flat with most observers, particularly the family members who'd been manipulated by Rebecca for years. Catherine Taylor, who testified about the impact of Rebecca's deception on her family's grieving process, spoke with a quiet dignity that made her words all the more powerful. "Rebecca Martinez didn't just kill my daughter," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. "She killed her and then spent 20 years torturing me with false hope and fake compassion. She sat in my living room and held my hand while I cried about not knowing what happened to Amelia, all the while knowing exactly what she had done. That isn't mental illness, that's evil." As the hearing progressed, more families came forward with stories of how Rebecca had manipulated their grief for her own purposes. Margaret Hendricks, whose son had disappeared in 2009, testified about how Rebecca had inserted herself into their family's crisis, offering comfort and guidance while secretly steering the investigation away from areas that might have yielded useful evidence. "She became like a family member to us," Margaret testified. "My husband and I trusted her completely, relied on her expertise and experience to help us navigate the worst period of our lives. To learn that she was potentially involved in our son's disappearance, that she might have been responsible for other families suffering while pretending to help us, it makes you question everything you believe about human nature." The revelation that Rebecca might have been connected to multiple murders across several states added layers of complexity to the legal proceedings. Prosecutors from Grand Rapids, Hibbing, and 2 other Minnesota towns attended the hearing as observers, taking notes about evidence and testimony that might be relevant to their own reopened investigations. Detective Chen testified about the investigation process, explaining how Rebecca's involvement as a civilian volunteer had actually hindered their efforts to solve Amelia Taylor's case. Ms. Martinez positioned herself as an expert on missing persons cases, Chen explained.
We valued her input, trusted her insights about search areas and investigative strategies. In retrospect, it's clear that she was systematically misleading us, steering our resources away from areas where we might have found evidence that would have led us to her. The most damning testimony came from Rebecca's own journal entries, which prosecutors read aloud in court. The entries revealed not just Rebecca's guilt in Amelia's murder, but her psychological satisfaction in manipulating the subsequent investigation and the victim's family. April 3, 2010. Catherine Taylor called today asking for advice about whether to hire a private investigator. I told her to wait, that the police were making progress and the PI might interfere with their work. The truth is, I don't want anyone else looking into this case. I've worked too hard to control how this story gets told. Catherine trusts me completely now. Sometimes I think she loves me more than she loved Amelia. September 15, 2015, 12 years today. Detective Chen asked me to speak at the memorial service about the importance of never giving up hope. The irony is almost too delicious. I'm the person they turn to when they need inspiration to keep searching for a girl I killed myself. If they only knew how perfectly I've played this role, how completely I've fooled all of them. As these entries were read in court, observers could see Rebecca's reaction. Rather than shame or remorse, her face showed something that looked almost like pride, as if she was finally being recognized for the elaborate performance she had maintained for 2 decades. The journal entries also revealed Rebecca's detailed knowledge of police procedures and investigative techniques, knowledge she had gained through her volunteer work and then used to stay ahead of detection. She had attended citizen police academies, cultivated relationships with law enforcement personnel, and studied criminal psychology, all in service of maintaining her deception. Judge Hendrickson ordered Rebecca Martinez held without bail, citing both the severity of the charges and the risk that she might flee the jurisdiction. The judge also noted that Rebecca's demonstrated ability to manipulate and deceive made her a potential danger to any community where she might try to establish herself. Ms. Martinez has shown a remarkable capacity for deception and manipulation, Judge Hendrickson stated.
Following the preliminary hearing, the investigation into Rebecca's potential involvement in other crimes intensified. The FBI officially joined the task force examining unsolved disappearances across the upper Midwest, bringing resources and expertise that local departments lacked. Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in serial crime patterns, established a field office in Duluth to coordinate the multi-jurisdictional investigation. What we're dealing with here is unprecedented, Agent Santos explained during a press conference held 3 days after the hearing. Ms. Martinez appears to have been operating for decades, using her position in various communities to identify potential victims and then to control the investigations that followed their disappearances. We're looking at cases across 4 states and spanning more than 20 years. The FBI's involvement brought new technologies and investigative techniques to bear on the case. Advanced DNA analysis was performed on evidence from cold cases where Rebecca had been involved, revealing previously undetected connections between crime scenes and Rebecca's presence in those communities. Cell phone records, credit card transactions, and travel documents were analyzed to create a comprehensive timeline of Rebecca's movements over the past 2 decades. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its consistency. Rebecca had moved from community to community, typically staying 3 to 5 years in each location. During her time in each town, she would establish herself as a volunteer with organizations that dealt with missing persons or domestic violence. Within her first year in each location, at least one person matching her preferred victim profile would disappear. Rebecca would then insert herself into the search efforts and subsequent investigations, often becoming a trusted advisor to both families and law enforcement. After several years of this pattern, Rebecca would quietly relocate to a new community, citing personal reasons or job opportunities.
She had managed this cycle 7 times over 23 years, leaving behind a trail of unsolved cases and grieving families who had no idea that their trusted advocate was actually the person responsible for their suffering. The town of Ely, Minnesota, where Rebecca had lived from 2012 to 2016, provided perhaps the clearest example of her modus operandi. During her time there, 2 young people had disappeared: David Peterson, a 19-year-old college student, and Amy Chen, a 21-year-old artist who had been planning to move to Chicago to pursue her career. Both victims had expressed dissatisfaction with small-town life and had talked about leaving to find better opportunities elsewhere. Both had been found dead in remote locations months after their disappearances, and both cases had remained unsolved despite extensive investigations. Rebecca Martinez had been actively involved in both search efforts and had maintained close relationships with both families throughout the investigation process. Sheriff Robert Johnson of St. Louis County, which included Ely, reopened both cases immediately after Rebecca's arrest in Duluth. We're going back through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every decision that was made during those investigations. We now know that someone with intimate knowledge of both crimes was actively participating in our efforts to solve them. We have to assume that our investigations were compromised from the beginning. The psychological impact of these revelations extended far beyond the families directly affected by Rebecca's crimes. Communities across Minnesota struggled to process the idea that someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for so long, that a person could appear to be a pillar of compassion and civic engagement while actually being responsible for the very tragedies she claimed to be helping address. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, a psychiatrist who specialized in community trauma, was brought in to help various towns process the collective psychological impact of Rebecca's crimes. What we're dealing with is a fundamental breach of trust that goes to the heart of how communities function. People rely on the belief that those who step forward to help in times of crisis are genuinely motivated by compassion and civic duty. When that trust is violated so completely, it can undermine people's faith in their neighbors, their institutions, and their own judgment. The media coverage of Rebecca's case attracted attention from criminal justice experts around the world. The length of her deception, the sophistication of her methods, and the unique way she had weaponized community compassion made her case study material for understanding how predators could exploit social support systems.
Professor David Mitchell from the University of Minnesota's Criminal Justice Department began documenting Rebecca's case as an example of what he termed institutional parasitism, the way certain criminals could insert themselves into the very systems designed to prevent and solve crimes. Ms. Martinez represents a new category of serial offender, Professor Mitchell wrote in a paper that would be published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology. Rather than trying to avoid detection through secrecy and isolation, she achieved the same goal through hypervisibility and community integration. By positioning herself as indispensable to the victim advocacy community, she created a form of protective camouflage that allowed her to operate with impunity for decades. As winter deepened in Duluth and the full trial approached, the community continued to grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How many people had Rebecca Martinez killed? How many families had been manipulated and exploited by her false compassion? And perhaps most troubling of all, how many other Rebecca Martinezes might be operating in communities across the country, hiding behind masks of helpfulness while feeding off the very suffering they had caused? The trial of Rebecca Martinez began on a bitter February morning, 6 months after her arrest had shattered the illusion of safety that had allowed her to operate undetected for 2 decades. Snow fell steadily outside the courthouse windows as jury selection commenced. Each potential juror questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case and their ability to render an impartial verdict despite the extensive media coverage that had surrounded Rebecca's crimes. Sarah Chen sat in the witness waiting area, reviewing her testimony one final time. Over the past 6 months, the investigation had expanded to encompass 7 different jurisdictions and at least 12 potential victims. The FBI task force had identified a pattern of disappearances and murders that spanned from 1998 to 2020, all connected by Rebecca Martinez's presence in the affected communities and her subsequent involvement in the search and investigation efforts. The prosecution's case was overwhelming in its scope and detail. DNA evidence, fiber analysis, cell phone records, and Rebecca's own detailed journal entries created a comprehensive picture of a woman who had turned serial murder into a twisted form of performance art. DA Margaret Foster had assembled a team of 6 prosecutors to handle the various aspects of the case, from the original Amelia Taylor murder to the broader pattern of crimes across multiple states. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Foster began in her opening statement, "over the next several weeks, you will hear testimony about one of the most elaborate and cruel criminal enterprises in American legal history. The defendant, Rebecca Martinez, didn't just kill people, she turned their family's grief into her personal theater, their desperate search for answers into her source of entertainment and control." The first week of testimony focused on Amelia Taylor's murder, establishing the timeline of events and presenting the physical evidence that connected Rebecca to the crime. Catherine Taylor took the stand on the 3rd day, her testimony providing the emotional foundation that helped the jury understand the human cost of Rebecca's deception. "For 20 years, I trusted Rebecca Martinez with my deepest pain," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the tears that flowed freely down her cheeks. "She held me when I cried, helped me organize memorial services for my daughter, listened to me talk about my fears and hopes and dreams for finding Amelia alive. All the while, she knew exactly where my daughter was because she had put her there." The defense strategy remained focused on diminished mental capacity, with Rebecca's attorney arguing that her severe personality disorders had made her unable to appreciate the full scope of her actions. But this approach was undermined by the evidence of Rebecca's careful planning, her sophisticated understanding of investigative procedures, and her documented enjoyment of the power and control she had wielded over her victims' families. Dr. Patricia Winters returned to the stand to explain her psychological evaluation of Rebecca, but this time her testimony included insights gained from 6 months of additional interviews and analysis. "Miss Martinez exhibits what we might call predatory empathy," Dr. Winters explained to the jury. "She had an uncanny ability to understand what people needed to hear during their darkest moments, but she used this understanding not to heal, but to manipulate and control."
The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Rebecca Martinez herself took the stand in her own defense. Against the advice of her attorneys, Rebecca insisted on testifying, apparently believing that she could convince the jury that her actions had been motivated by genuine care for her victims and their families. "I loved Amelia Taylor," Rebecca said, looking directly at the jury members as she spoke. "Everything I did after she died was motivated by my desire to honor her memory and help her family find peace. Yes, I made a terrible mistake that night, but I spent 20 years trying to make amends for it." Under cross-examination by DA Foster, Rebecca's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. Foster systematically worked through Rebecca's journal entries, forcing her to explain passages that revealed her enjoyment of the family's suffering and her pride in her ability to deceive law enforcement. "Ms. Martinez, you wrote in your journal, and I quote, 'Catherine Taylor trusts me completely now. Sometimes I think she loves me more than she loved Amelia.' Can you explain to the jury what you meant by that statement?" Rebecca's composure faltered for the first time during the trial. I
That was taken out of context. I was just trying to document my relationship with the family. You also wrote, "The irony is almost too delicious. I'm the person they turn to when they need inspiration to keep searching for a girl I killed myself." Was that also just documentation? As Foster continued her cross-examination, Rebecca's true nature became increasingly apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Her answers revealed not remorse or mental illness, but a calculating intelligence that had taken pleasure in orchestrating elaborate deceptions. The jury watched with obvious disgust as Rebecca's mask of compassion slipped away to reveal the predator beneath. The trial's scope expanded during the fourth week as prosecutors presented evidence linking Rebecca to murders in 6 other communities. Families from across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan testified about how Rebecca had inserted herself into their lives during their darkest hours, offering comfort while secretly feeding off their desperation. Detective Lisa Chen from Hibbing testified about the reopened investigation into Marcus Johnson's death, describing how new evidence had revealed Rebecca's direct involvement in his murder. "We found fibers from Mr. Johnson's clothing in a storage unit that Miss Martinez had rented under an assumed name," Detective Chen explained. "We also discovered that she had been stalking Mr. Johnson for several weeks before his disappearance, documenting his routines and social activities in a notebook that we recovered from her home." Similar testimony was presented regarding the deaths of Jennifer Walsh and Susan Morrison in Grand Rapids, David Peterson and Amy Chen in Ely, and 3 other victims whose cases had been reopened based on Rebecca's pattern of behavior. In each case, Rebecca had identified young people who expressed dissatisfaction with their current circumstances, had cultivated relationships with them under the guise of mentorship or counseling, and had ultimately killed them when they tried to end the relationships or leave their communities. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided expert testimony about Rebecca's psychological profile and the likelihood that additional victims might be discovered as the investigation continued. Agent Maria Santos explained to the jury how Rebecca's crimes represented a unique form of serial murder that had been enabled by her exploitation of community support systems. Ms. Martinez didn't just kill her victims. She created an entire ecosystem of deception around each murder, using the grief and desperation of the families to fuel her own psychological needs for power and control. This made her incredibly difficult to detect because she was hiding in plain sight, protected by the very people she had victimized. The trial lasted 8 weeks, with over 200 pieces of evidence presented and testimony from nearly 60 witnesses. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that the defense's closing argument focused not on innocence, but on urging the jury to consider life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, arguing that Rebecca's mental illness warranted some degree of mercy.
The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Rebecca Martinez was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Amelia Taylor, Marcus Johnson, Jennifer Walsh, Susan Morrison, David Peterson, Amy Chen, and 4 other victims whose cases had been definitively linked to her through physical evidence and behavioral analysis. Judge Patricia Hendrickson sentenced Rebecca Martinez to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively for each murder conviction. Miss Martinez, your crimes represent a betrayal of trust so profound that it defies comprehension, Judge Hendrickson said as she pronounced sentence. You didn't just kill your victims, you tortured their families for decades, turning their love and grief into weapons against them. The court can conceive of no punishment adequate to your crimes, but we can ensure that you will never again have the opportunity to harm another human being. Rebecca showed no emotion as the sentence was read, maintaining the same detached composure she had displayed throughout much of the trial.
As she was led from the courtroom in shackles, observers noted that she seemed more concerned with maintaining her dignity than with the finality of her fate. The conviction brought a sense of closure to some of the affected families, but for many, the resolution of Rebecca's legal case marked only the beginning of a longer process of healing and recovery. Catherine Taylor, who had attended every day of the trial, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse after the sentencing. "Justice has been served, but justice can't bring back my daughter or give me back the 20 years I spent wondering what happened to her," Catherine said. "What I hope comes from this terrible experience is that other communities will be better protected from people like Rebecca Martinez, and that families going through similar tragedies will have better support systems that can't be exploited by predators." The institutional changes that followed Rebecca's conviction were comprehensive and far-reaching. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension established new protocols for civilian involvement in missing persons investigations, including background checks and psychological evaluations for volunteers who sought ongoing roles in search and investigation efforts. Police departments across the Upper Midwest implemented new training programs to help officers identify potential signs of manipulative behavior among civilian volunteers and victim advocates. The Duluth Police Department created a new position, Victim Services Coordinator, to provide professional oversight of civilian involvement in criminal investigations and to ensure that families received support from trained counselors rather than well-meaning but potentially problematic volunteers. The Rebecca Martinez case also led to the establishment of the Amelia Taylor Center for Missing Persons, a professional organization that provided evidence-based support services to families dealing with disappearances. The center, funded by donations from across the country, employed licensed social workers, psychologists, and victim advocates who had undergone extensive training and background screening. Catherine Taylor served on the board of directors of the center, using her painful experience to help create systems that would prevent other families from being victimized by predators like Rebecca Martinez. Amelia's death was a tragedy, but if we can use what happened to her to protect other families, then maybe some meaning can come from our suffering, Catherine explained during the center's opening ceremony. The psychological impact of Rebecca's crimes continued to reverberate through the affected communities long after her conviction. Support groups formed for people who had been manipulated by Rebecca, providing a space for individuals to process their feelings of betrayal and to rebuild their capacity to trust others. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the psychiatrist who had been working with affected communities, published a comprehensive study of the psychological aftermath of Rebecca's crimes. Her research revealed that people who had been deceived by Rebecca experienced symptoms similar to those of domestic abuse survivors: hypervigilance, difficulty trusting their own judgment, and a persistent sense that other people in their lives might be concealing dangerous secrets.
The Rebecca Martinez case represents a form of community-wide psychological abuse, Dr. Hartman wrote in her study. Her victims weren't just the people she killed, they were the hundreds of community members who were manipulated and exploited by her false compassion. The healing process for these communities will take years, if not decades. The media attention surrounding Rebecca's case led to increased scrutiny of victim advocacy organizations across the country. Professional associations implemented new standards for volunteer screening and supervision, while law enforcement agencies developed better protocols for managing civilian involvement in criminal investigations. Several documentary filmmakers and true crime authors produced works examining Rebecca's case, focusing on the unique aspects of her crimes and the community response to her deception. These productions helped raise awareness about the potential for predators to exploit volunteer organizations and support networks, leading to improved safeguards in communities across the United States.
6 months after Rebecca's conviction, the FBI task force concluded its investigation into her activities, officially linking her to 12 murders across 4 states and identifying her as a suspect in 6 additional cases where evidence was insufficient for prosecution. The final report described Rebecca Martinez as one of the most sophisticated and successful serial killers in American criminal history, whose ability to manipulate community support systems allowed her to operate undetected for over 2 decades. The task force's work led to the development of new investigative protocols that were adopted by law enforcement agencies across the country. The Martinez Protocol, as it became known, established guidelines for identifying and monitoring individuals who inserted themselves into criminal investigations or victim support networks with unusual frequency or intensity. Detective Sarah Chen, who had spent 5 years working on the Amelia Taylor case before Rebecca's arrest, found herself transformed by the experience of uncovering such an elaborate deception. The case had tested every investigative skill she possessed and had forced her to question assumptions about human nature that had guided her work for over 2 decades. Rebecca Martinez taught me that evil doesn't always look like what we expect, Sarah reflected during an interview conducted 1 year after the trial. We're trained to look for suspicious behavior, for people who seem out of place or who act strangely. Rebecca was successful because she acted exactly the way we expected a good person to act. She was the helper, the comforter, the person who stepped forward when others stepped back. Sarah's insights from the Martinez case led to her appointment as the head of a new Minnesota State Police unit dedicated to investigating cases involving potential civilian interference in criminal investigations. The unit worked with local departments to identify patterns of behavior that might indicate the presence of individuals like Rebecca Martinez in their communities. The economic impact of Rebecca's crimes extended far beyond the direct costs of investigation and prosecution. Communities where she had operated experienced significant drops in volunteer participation for victim advocacy organizations, as people became afraid to trust others who claimed to be motivated by compassion. Several organizations that had relied on volunteer support were forced to close or significantly reduce their services. The town of Ely, where Rebecca had lived during the murders of David Peterson and Amy Chen, struggled with the stigma associated with having harbored such a dangerous individual. Tourism, which had been a significant part of the local economy, declined, as the town became known primarily for its connection to Rebecca's crimes rather than its natural beauty and outdoor recreation opportunities. Mayor Jennifer Thompson of Ely initiated a community healing project designed to help residents process their collective trauma and rebuild their sense of identity. "We can't let Rebecca Martinez define who we are as a community," Mayor Thompson declared during a town hall meeting held 18 months after Rebecca's conviction. "We were her victims too, and we have to reclaim our story from her." The healing project included public art installations honoring Rebecca's victims, community gardening projects that created spaces for reflection and renewal, and educational programs that taught residents how to identify and report suspicious behavior without becoming paralyzed by mistrust. The legal ramifications of Rebecca's case extended well beyond her criminal conviction. Several families filed civil lawsuits against organizations that had allowed Rebecca to volunteer without
Adequate screening or supervision. These cases resulted in settlements that totaled millions of dollars and led to significant changes in how volunteer organizations managed their personnel. The Northwoods Missing Persons Support Group, which Rebecca had helped establish and had used as a hunting ground for potential victims, disbanded following revelations about her involvement. The organization's assets were transferred to the newly established Amelia Taylor Center, ensuring that the resources Rebecca had helped build would be used to provide legitimate support to families dealing with disappearances. Catherine Taylor's journey toward healing took many forms over the months and years following Rebecca's conviction. She participated in grief counseling, became an advocate for improved victim services, and slowly began to rebuild relationships with people in her community.
The process was complicated by her need to distinguish between genuine support and the kind of manipulative pseudo-compassion that Rebecca had provided. Learning to trust again after being deceived so completely is like learning to walk after a devastating injury, Catherine explained during a speech at the Amelia Taylor Center's second anniversary celebration. You have to start slowly, testing each step, building strength gradually. But eventually you can move forward and you can help others who are facing similar challenges. Catherine's relationship with Detective Sarah Chen evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. They worked together on several initiatives designed to improve how law enforcement agencies interacted with victims' families and to create better safeguards against the kind of exploitation that Rebecca had practiced. The academic study of Rebecca's case produced insights that influenced criminal justice education programs across the country. Law enforcement training curricula were updated to include modules on identifying and managing manipulative volunteers, while social work and psychology programs began teaching students about the potential for predators to exploit helping relationships. Professor David Mitchell from the University of Minnesota published a comprehensive case study of Rebecca's crimes that became required reading in criminal justice programs nationwide. His research identified 12 specific warning signs that might indicate the presence of a helper killer in a community, providing law enforcement agencies with tools for early identification and intervention. The warning signs included excessive volunteering for multiple victim-related causes, detailed knowledge of investigative procedures that exceeded what civilians typically possessed, unusual interest in crime scene details, patterns of being present at multiple unrelated disappearances or deaths, resistance to background checks or psychological evaluations, and attempts to steer investigations toward or away from specific areas or suspects. Rebecca Martinez's incarceration at the Minnesota Correctional Facility Stillwater marked the end of her ability to harm others directly, but her case continued to generate research and discussion among criminal justice professionals. She refused all requests for interviews from researchers, journalists, and law enforcement officials, maintaining the same controlled silence she had employed during much of her trial. Prison staff reported that Rebecca adapted to incarceration with unusual ease, quickly establishing herself as a model prisoner who helped other inmates navigate the facility's procedures and programs. This behavior concerned psychologists who worked with the prison system, as it suggested that Rebecca was continuing her pattern of positioning herself as a helper while potentially pursuing hidden agendas. Dr. Patricia Winters, who had conducted Rebecca's original psychological evaluation, published a follow-up study based on observations of Rebecca's prison behavior. Quote, Ms. Martinez appears to be recreating the same dynamic in prison that she employed in the outside world. She has positioned herself as a resource and helper to other inmates, which gives her a form of power and control even within the constraints of incarceration. Unquote. The study raised questions about whether individuals like Rebecca Martinez could ever be truly rehabilitated, or whether their fundamental psychological makeup made them permanently dangerous regardless of their circumstances. These questions had implications for how the criminal justice system handled similar cases and for the development of treatment programs for offenders with comparable profiles.
This document chronicles the long-term aftermath and legacy of Rebecca Martinez's conviction for multiple murders, focusing particularly on the case of Amelia Taylor and the transformative impact it had on victim advocacy, law enforcement practices, and community safety protocols. The story begins 3 years after Rebecca's conviction, with Catherine Taylor visiting a memorial garden created in her daughter Amelia's honor behind the newly established Amelia Taylor Center for Missing Persons. The garden, featuring native Minnesota plants that bloom in different seasons, symbolizes the ongoing nature of Amelia's legacy. Catherine, now supported by Detective Sarah Chen, who had become a close friend, reflects on how her daughter would have been 41 and pursued her dream of becoming a veterinarian. The Amelia Taylor Center grew dramatically, expanding from a local initiative to serve families across 6 states with over 30 professional staff members.
Under the leadership of Dr. Michael Rodriguez, selected for his credentials in clinical psychology and nonprofit management, the center developed what became known as the Minnesota Model of Victim Services. This approach emphasized transparency, professional qualifications, and strict oversight, directly addressing the vulnerabilities that Rebecca Martinez had exploited for decades. The center's core philosophy, as articulated by Dr. Rodriguez, focused on empowering families rather than creating dependency, building resilience rather than prolonging helplessness. This represented a fundamental shift from the informal support networks that Rebecca had manipulated to maintain control over grieving families. Several of Rebecca's surviving victims transformed their traumatic experiences into advocacy work. Margaret Hendricks, whose son Rebecca murdered in 2009, became a victims' rights advocate, specializing in helping families navigate legal and emotional challenges. Her work led to the development of educational materials distributed nationwide, providing practical guidance on identifying manipulative volunteers and creating safe support systems. Margaret's insight proved particularly valuable. While Rebecca had stolen her son, the experience taught her to distinguish between genuine support and manipulative control, knowledge she used to protect other families. Detective Sarah Chen's career evolved to head Minnesota's Civilian Interference Investigation Unit, documenting numerous cases where individuals attempted to inappropriately insert themselves into criminal investigations. While none matched Rebecca's scope of deception, the vigilance her case created prevented other forms of interference and exploitation. Training programs developed from Rebecca's case became mandatory across Minnesota and were adopted by 12 other states. These programs taught officers to maintain appropriate boundaries with civilian volunteers while encouraging legitimate community involvement in public safety. Broader criminal patterns. Agent Maria Santos's FBI research revealed that helper killers were more widespread than previously recognized. New cases emerged bearing similarities to Rebecca's methods, including a woman in Oregon manipulating families while secretly aiding criminals, and a man in Texas sabotaging search efforts while positioning himself as an expert guide. Santos's comprehensive analysis showed that these offenders were particularly dangerous because they exploited the very systems designed to help victims and solve crimes, making understanding their methods crucial for preventing future tragedies. Dr. Patricia Winters continued studying Rebecca through prison records, identifying patterns that helped predict which offenders would continue manipulative behavior in correctional settings. Rebecca herself remained unrepentant, refusing interviews and treatment while attempting to position herself as a helper to other inmates.
Psychologist Dr. Amanda Foster noted that Rebecca's expressions of regret were superficial and manipulative rather than genuine. 10 years after the case's resolution, Duluth had largely healed from Rebecca's deception, implementing new community safety programs and strengthened volunteer screening processes. The annual memorial service evolved into a broader commemoration of all violent crime victims, emphasizing community vigilance and professional victim services. Catherine Taylor found purpose despite her losses, remarrying and developing relationships with young people who reminded her of Amelia's potential. Her reflection captured the transformation. While Amelia never became the veterinarian she dreamed of being, her memory helped create a community that protects vulnerable members and refuses to let predators hide behind compassionate facades. The center trained over 200 victim advocates during its first decade, creating a professional support network across the upper Midwest. Detective Sarah Chen became a nationally recognized expert, testifying before Congress about federal standards for volunteer involvement in law enforcement. 15 years later, a new generation grew up understanding that evil could wear compassionate masks, and that protection required both individual vigilance and institutional safeguards.
Emma Richardson, Amelia's cousin, pursued criminal psychology and specialized in studying offenders who manipulated support systems, identifying over 50 similar cases across North America. The protocols developed from Rebecca's case had global impact, adapted for use worldwide, and contributing to Interpol's creation of a special unit investigating offenders who exploited humanitarian organizations. The Minnesota model influenced victim advocacy organizations internationally. 25 years after Amelia's disappearance, Rebecca remained imprisoned with parole routinely denied as new evidence of manipulative behavior emerged. The case became a standard study in law schools, social work programs, and psychology curricula, illustrating how criminal behavior could exploit institutional blind spots. Detective Sarah Chen's final case file entry summarized the profound lessons learned. Rebecca's crimes revealed how predators could exploit victim protection systems, demonstrating the need for professional oversight, background screening, and institutional safeguards. The resulting protocols prevented countless tragedies and made communities safer and more resilient. The Memorial Garden continued to serve as a peaceful place of reflection, with additional memorials for other victims whose cases were solved through lessons learned from Rebecca's crimes. Together, they formed a testament to finding meaning and purpose even in devastating losses, ensuring that Amelia Taylor's legacy continued protecting others from similar exploitation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.